Hello, I'm Nicholas Tresilian. I'm the author of this website. Like everybody else, I'm extremely aware that the COVID virus has done huge damage to the livelihoods of many, many artists. I'm also impressed in its own way by the way that the government has chucked in much more money than it usually does towards the arts. However, I'm also aware, and I think people will gradually find out, that a lot of that money will not go to artists as such. It'll go to preserving the incomes, the pensions, the working fabric, the paperwork, etc., of the many art administrators that this country can now afford. And as such, the COVID virus will really add momentum to what is already growing. The threat to the independence of our traditional individual artist. The artist is a kind of cultural singularity, producing works for contemplation, works for delivery of aesthetic value, and works for not being interfered in, essentially closed images. And of course, in the visual arts, either the frame around the painting, or it used to be around the painting, or the plinth, which used to be under the sculpture, until the modern age at least, emphasizes the point. These are closed images, they're finished. Once they have happened, they can't do anything else. You can only look at them, or if they're books, you can read them, or if they're plays, you can watch them. And except when they're pantomimes, you can't get up on the stage and join in the play, let alone the ballet, let alone the opera. So that great tradition of closed images is really founded on the concept of the individual artist, and particularly in the visual arts, that individual artist, except if he or she becomes wealthy enough to afford assistance in a large atelier, is essentially himself or herself on their own and unprotected in what is now going to be a commercially and financially very hostile world. And I think that this will push, these circumstances will push artists in a direction to which art has already been moving, but not so explicitly, towards, out of the closed image and towards the open image. In visual art, you see that in installation art, which gets people inside the image, and in contextual art, which gets art out and the people in it into the surrounding environment. Both ways of defeating the traditional closure of the art gallery, which reflects the traditional closure of the closed image. And that movement, which is already happening towards, in effect, the open image, I think will be accelerated, but in a much more gravid way than until now, by the COVID virus and the afterworld it will leave behind, because it will require artists to form their own institutions, to work collectively together, to form social bodies, collectives strong enough to survive these terrible winds of change, and to incorporate in a way that gives them sufficient strength not to have to rely on large institutions of non-artists to pave their way. I was myself, for many years, a member of a very much a pioneering group in the sense of exploring the open image, the Artist Placement Group, founded by John Latham and Barbara Stavini, and which in its course of its time had a small group of artists on the board of a company, which they were quick to form. And I became one of the directors too, along with Stuart Brisley and Ian Breakwell and a wonderful musician called Hugh Davis. Everyone I've mentioned now is already, alas, dead. But I survive and I carry on the message. And the message of APG was really that context is all the art. In other words, APG was about getting art re-engaged, disengaged from the ivory tower, re-engaged in the social process and in whatever happens to be driving the social and economic process, and in general to re-engage with the relationship between human beings and the world, and to do it in a way which involved a statistical mass of beings, of people participating. If your memory goes back far enough, the seminal work in all this was produced in the 1950s, early 60s. It was called This Is Tomorrow. It was produced by the Independent Group, which was an amazing group of independent thinkers based at the ICA in its old rooms in Dover Street, and which has done more to transform the arts, I think, than any other cooperative since the last war. Just as important as the Bauhaus in its own particular way, though much less well remembered now. The ICA, the independent group, began also the whole idea of artists working in concert to produce a finished result which involved lots of other people besides themselves, which could accommodate large flows of people through it. It was led by the wonderful Richard Hamilton, Britain's first pop artist, certainly one of our most intelligent artists since the war. Alas, now also dead. But we're now talking about the future. And my view is that APG, while it pioneered an artist collective, it was certainly not the first, but it pioneered an artist collective, and it pioneered the idea of getting art engaged in the sort of granular business of society. And it was quite successful for a while in getting artists actually into government organizations, the Scottish Office, the DHSS, and so forth, as to act as sort of catalysts of change, of the bit of sand in the oyster that caused the diamond to form, so to speak. And there were, in those days, very senior civil servants who were prepared to have, APG called them incidental persons. The artist is an incidental person who sort of came in from the edge and did unexpected things and made unprompted changes. And there were civil servants who believed that their government system was so rigid and so stuck that it could benefit from this kind of risk-taking. Later, I'm afraid, Mrs. Thatcher changed all that and changed the civil service in a very radical way, from which we're still suffering now, I think, in the general inability of the civil service to cope really with the COVID virus, let alone the government. But there was this flash in our culture 40 odd years ago, when there were a lot of grown-up people prepared to look at change. Well, now we have a world which has been stirred up much more thoroughly than by either senior civil servants or Mrs. Thatcher, and where there are a lot of people prepared to look at change. And I think the ground is fertile for what I used to call self-organizing artist networks. I wrote a paper for APG on that subject. SOANs, S-O-A-N, with a small s, self-organizing artist networks. But APG itself never really succeeded in being a SOAN. That is to say, it did placements, but the placements were always of individual artists. The placements were radical in the sense that they were on an open brief. The host organization could not say, we want you to do this, or we'd like you to paint that. The artists went in there, took their own view. I remember Ian Breakwell, who was injected into Broadmoor and the other high security prison, whose name I forget. He did things that government officials had never thought of doing. He talked to the prisoners. He slept in their cells. He ate with them. And in fact, that particular report is still under the Official Secrets Act. It's considered so subversive. However, nonetheless, that was Ian Breakwell by himself. APG placed individual artists. It couldn't get the idea moving onto the self-organizing artist network per se, the pool of talent necessary to cope with the world in which we now live. And I believe that we are in a moment of great promise for the ganging together of artists in clumps and the pooling of talents, the pooling of viewpoints, which after all, industry is doing. That's how we have the whole of the network of IT around the world, the girdle around the world of wires and signals. Industry and commerce are extraordinarily adept in exchanging ideas, molding ideas into new ideas, and not losing too much pride in the process, and indeed gaining the feeling of collective, nay, I use the word second time, corporate success. So the possibilities for bringing brilliant talents together to deal with major problems, like how do we live in this world? How do we keep our species alive in this world? What language do we use? What communal behavior will we, or consensual behavior will we deploy to continue to survive on the basis that it is worth keeping the human being and the human species going? And there are many good things it may yet do if it's allowed not to destroy itself. But and the arts in that respect have always, in their more default role, played a central position in that struggle. If you look back, the West has long looked at art really through the wrong end of the evolutionary telescope. We see all art as aesthetically driven. From the very beginning, if you read Gombrich's great story of art, which is a wonderful work of scholarship, but it's all about how ancient people gradually learned to paint more and more like the classical and to paint the figural correctly, and then how the West came out of its primitive age and inherited those abilities and skills. And then what a shock it all was when suddenly in the late 19th, early 20th century, it all blew up and deconstructed. Gombrich, I remember in his original book called Modernist Art Experimental. And there was a general thought that art was probably going to die, but it didn't. It began to transform instead. It began to transform from an individualistic, contemplative basis to a new basis involving a more collectivist view, a more collectivist experience, and gradually more combination of artistic vision to bring it about. So if you should think that that is irregular and that really art has gone off the rails, I ask you to look back over 40,000 years of art history, and you will see that art based on open images, open participatory images, is actually the default. 30,000 years of cave art during the hunter-gatherer period. 10 or 12,000 years of tomb and temple art during the agrarian period. And cave art deconstructed and became something other. And now aesthetic art, which came out of the tombs and temples, has also deconstructed and is becoming something other. And what we're seeing is a massive phase transition from the individual to the collective, from the closed image to the open. And that is just part of the rhythm of art and the way that art responds to changing patterns of the human ecology. That's another story. To get onto that story, we'd have to start by considering the fact that art is not just about space, it can also be about time, and that is because we have two ways of seeing the world. The human eye follows the photon. It can see the world as a particle, and it can see it as a wave. And those two ways of presenting art are two ways of responding to our evolutionary pattern and progress through the world as we stagger into periods of explosive change, like farming, like the Industrial Revolution, and then at the end of those periods of explosive change are propelled unexpectedly back into periods of scarcity, what you might call super scarcity, scarcity at the next ecological level up. And when I use that term, I think you'll recognize with some sense of where we might be going at the present time, where our world was already going before the COVID virus gave it a kick. What will this will mean for the arts, I think, is for the arts themselves to discover. I think the arts have a complementary role with the sciences. And just as the sciences tell us the world from the perspective of rational meaning, the arts tell us the world from the perspective of our combined relational meaning. The arts are about relational meaning, is about images which bind. They don't primarily exist, works of art, paintings, sculptures, plays and so on. They don't primarily exist to give information about the world to somebody else. They use giving information about the world, the landscape, the king, the prince, the meal, the slab of meat, the beautiful Venus or whatever, or of course beautiful Apollo, as a hook onto which to hang this extraordinary second property of language, to bind rather than to distribute meaning. And that can operate in the small and precise way of a painting by a Vermeer or a Van Dyck, but it can also operate in a collective way. And if you have any doubts about that, just go and look at a mass in a Catholic cathedral, or its derivative, the Eucharist in an Anglican cathedral, and track it through, track what is going on through it, and how it is mixing together life and death in a kind of semi-real world, which is at the same time binding to the imagination, and which survives and keeps itself as a belief intact, despite all sorts of variations and assaults going on in the world outside. And that's how artistic meaning holds its own as well. And in another talk, I'll tell you that there's actually an equation for it, quite a short equation, which was produced by a wonderful Belgian scientist called Ilya Prigogine, and which he first drew into, wrote down in a book on the thermodynamic process of irreversible systems, and which many years later, he himself realized in a footnote, a big thick footnote to his latest book, was the most important equation he'd ever written. And it was just simply an equation which said that you could have positives and negatives in the same reality. Whereas Aristotle and the rest of science says a thing cannot both not have the same properties. So another name for that law is the law of the excluded middle. Well, Prigogine wrote the equation for the excluded middle, and that's where art lives. And that's why it's so important to all of us, because we live in the excluded middle too, and it is our language. Till next time.